The line went dead while the shells were still falling, and my superiors were waiting for reports that no longer existed. The system said maintain the network, but the network was buried under brick and ice. I crawled through the drainage channel with frozen wire in my hands, knowing a single break could leave a company blind. Orders demanded structure, the rubble allowed none. By then, survival was no longer about holding ground. It was about keeping one thin line alive in the dark. In September 1942, the German Sixth Army was advancing toward the industrial city of Stalingrad, on the western bank of the Volga River. The campaign formed part of Operation Blue, the German summer offensive aimed at securing the oil fields of the Caucasus and cutting Soviet transport routes along the Volga. By early autumn, the fighting had shifted from open steppe to dense urban terrain. Factories, rail yards, apartment blocks, and grain silos became defensive strongpoints. Artillery bombardment reduced large sections of the city to rubble, yet the destruction did not end resistance. It altered its character. Among the Soviet formations committed to the defense was the 62nd Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov. Ordered to hold the western bank at all costs, the Army relied on small unit tactics, infiltration, and close engagement to offset German advantages in armor and air support. Reinforcements crossed the Volga under artillery fire, often at night, and entered combat with limited preparation. Within one of these rifle divisions was Senior Sergeant Mikhail Petrovich Sokolov, a platoon signals non-commissioned officer assigned to coordinate field communications between forward rifle companies and battalion headquarters. Born in 1919 in a rural district near Tula, Sokolov had completed technical schooling before conscription. His pre-war training emphasized telephone line installation, maintenance of portable radio sets, and message encryption procedures. In open-field doctrine, signal detachments operated from relative cover behind advancing infantry. In Stalingrad, there was little distance between front and rear. By mid-September, Sokolov's battalion held a sector near the Red October factory complex. The industrial buildings offered both protection and hazard. Thick brick walls could stop small arms fire, but constant shelling collapsed roofs and severed lines. Steel beams and machinery created a maze of obstacles. Smoke and dust limited visibility. Every few hours, artillery concentrations shifted the defensive layout. Sokolov's routine began before first light. He inspected wire spools, checked hand-cranked field telephones, and tested connections running from battalion command posts to company strongpoints positioned in shattered workshops. The lines were laid across courtyards, through blasted windows, and along corridors littered with debris. He carried pliers, insulated tape, spare cable, and a notebook of call signs. His task was not to fight in the foremost assault, but to ensure that orders, artillery adjustments, and casualty reports could move through the rubble. The operational problem in that sector was not merely enemy pressure, it was continuity. German infantry, supported by engineers and assault guns, launched repeated attacks to seize factory buildings one section at a time. Each advance brought flamethrowers and grenades into close quarters. When Soviet positions shifted even a few meters, telephone lines became exposed or were cut by shrapnel. Radios offered limited relief. Batteries were scarce, and the dense concrete and steel interfered with signals. Early reports from the battalion described increasing difficulty maintaining contact with the left flank company. Runners sent with written messages often failed to return. Some were killed crossing open ground. Others became disoriented in the smoke-filled interior. Commanders required timely information to coordinate counterattacks, yet the means to transmit it were degrading. On 18 September, German forces intensified bombardment against the factory district. Observers noted concentrated shelling on known command posts. Shortly after midday, Sokolov received word that 2 primary lines to the forward platoons had gone silent. He assembled a small repair team and moved through a partially collapsed assembly hall toward the suspected break. The men advanced cautiously, aware that enemy patrols sometimes infiltrated through gaps in the line. The first severed cable lay exposed in a courtyard cratered by mortar fire. Shrapnel had sliced it cleanly. Sokolov knelt beside the break, stripped insulation with a knife, and twisted copper ends together before securing them with tape. He tested the handset. The connection crackled but held. Within minutes, artillery adjustments resumed through that circuit. The second line proved more difficult. It had been routed along a wall that no longer existed. Bricks and twisted girders covered the path. While tracing the cable, one of Sokolov's men was struck by sniper fire from an upper-story window across the yard. The team dragged him behind cover, but the wound was severe. The repair work paused as stretcher-bearers attempted evacuation. Such interruptions became common. By late September, signal detachments in the 62nd Army reported casualty rates comparable to rifle units. The proximity of the fighting meant that communication personnel were often under direct fire. Despite this, official doctrine still treated signal sections as support elements expected to function continuously. Reports from headquarters emphasized maintaining command cohesion, even as physical infrastructure disintegrated. Within Sokolov's battalion, the strain showed in small details. Batteries for the RBM portable radios were rationed carefully. When exhausted, operators reverted to wire or messengers. Replacement cable arrived irregularly across the Volga, dependent on nighttime ferry crossings vulnerable to air attack. Improvised splicing became standard practice. Insulation was salvaged from abandoned civilian wiring. Telephone handsets were repaired with scavenged components. The operational environment narrowed daily. German forces pressed closer to the river, reducing Soviet-held territory to a strip in some places, only a few hundred meters wide. This compression placed command posts nearer to frontline positions. While it shortened some communication lines, it also meant that any breakthrough threatened immediate encirclement. Sokolov's role required constant movement between positions that were no longer clearly defined. Front lines shifted within buildings. A room secured in the morning might be contested by afternoon. Maintaining a map of wire routes became increasingly theoretical. Instead, Sokolov relied on memory and observation, marking junctions with scraps of cloth or chalk on walls. Early signs of systemic limitation appeared in the growing reliance on redundancy. Battalion commanders ordered duplicate lines laid whenever possible, yet each additional cable increased exposure. Repair teams stretched thin, sometimes choosing which connection to restore, first based on urgency rather than priority protocol. Decisions that once followed standard operating procedure became practical judgments made under fire. Weather added another layer of difficulty. Autumn rains turned open areas into mud, complicating movement of equipment. Moisture seeped into cable insulation, causing intermittent failures. In the evenings, as temperatures dropped, condensation affected radio components. Maintenance consumed hours that might otherwise have been used for rest. Reports from neighboring units indicated similar patterns. Communications faltered during peak assaults, isolating platoons for critical periods. In some instances, artillery support failed to arrive because correction data could not be transmitted. After-action summaries acknowledged these gaps, but attributed them primarily to enemy intensity rather than infrastructural fragility. Within his platoon, Sokolov observed the cumulative effect. Faces grew drawn, movements slowed, conversations shortened to essentials, yet the work continued. Each restored line represented a temporary reassertion of order within disorder. Each functioning handset allowed a commander to adjust defenses, request ammunition, or report casualties. By the end of September, German units had captured significant portions of the Red October complex. Soviet defenders withdrew into remaining workshops closer to the riverbank. Sokolov relocated the battalion command post to a basement reinforced with sandbags and steel plates. From there, New lines were laid through narrow trenches dug between ruins. The situation remained unstable. Casualty lists lengthened. Replacement personnel arrived with minimal familiarity with the terrain. The expectation from higher command was unchanged. Hold the western bank. Prevent the enemy from reaching the Volga in strength. As October approached, the battalion's sector contracted again. The distance between opposing positions sometimes measured less than 50 meters. Communication lines crossed areas under constant observation. Repair sorties required timing with suppressive fire or darkness. In this tightening space, Sokolov continued his routine: inspection, repair, testing, notation, while evidence accumulated that the systems designed for coordinated maneuver warfare were strained beyond their intended limits. The factory district had become less a line and more a fragmented series of isolated strongpoints connected by fragile wires. The work did not yet suggest survival or defeat. It remained a matter of maintaining contact for another day, another hour, within a battlefield widely regarded as among the most lethal of the war. The pressures were mounting, but the structure still held, tenuously. By early October 1942, temperatures along the Volga began to fall sharply at night. Smoke from continuous bombardment hung low over the factory district, mixing with mist from the river. The German Sixth Army intensified efforts to eliminate remaining Soviet pockets west of the water. Assault detachments moved, building to building, supported by close artillery fire and Stuka dive bombing when weather allowed. The 62nd Army's positions near Red October and Barrikady were reduced to fragmented defensive cells. Within this environment, communication failures became more frequent and more consequential. Battalion logs from the period note repeated interruptions lasting hours rather than minutes. When lines failed, units were forced to operate autonomously. Sometimes this allowed initiative. More often it led to misaligned counterattacks or delayed withdrawals. Senior Sergeant Sokolov's section had been reduced to 4 men fit for duty. 2 replacements, recently ferried across the Volga, lacked experience under sustained urban fire. The remaining veteran, Corporal Andrei Malinin, had already suffered a minor shrapnel wound, but refused evacuation. Together they maintained what remained of the battalion's wire network. On 5th October, a coordinated German push struck the right flank of Sokolov's battalion. Heavy artillery preceded infantry movement, collapsing outer walls and igniting storage areas filled with oil residue. Within minutes, 3 primary communication lines failed simultaneously. Reports ceased from the forward companies occupying machine shops near the rail spur. The battalion commander, operating from the reinforced basement, required immediate confirmation of whether the right flank had been penetrated. Without information, reserves could not be committed effectively. Runners dispatched earlier in the week had not returned from that sector. The decision was made to attempt restoration of at least one wire connection before dusk. Sokolov and Malinin advanced through a trench partially filled with debris. German small arms fire intermittently swept the open spaces between buildings. The cable they followed had been buried shallowly, but shell impacts exposed and shredded sections. Twice they repaired short breaks, testing continuity with a field telephone. Each time the line held briefly before failing again farther forward. As they moved deeper toward the contested workshop, the sound of close quarters fighting became distinct. Grenade detonations and automatic fire echoing within concrete chambers. The absence of sustained Soviet machine gun fire suggested ammunition shortages or casualties among crews. Midway across a courtyard, Malinin was struck in the shoulder. He remained conscious and insisted that Sokolov continue alone, while he applied a field dressing. With only limited cable remaining on his spool, Sokolov pressed forward, crawling along the base of a wall where fragments of brick provided partial cover. He located a major break where the cable had been severed by a direct hit. Beyond that point, The wire disappeared beneath rubble leading toward the forward company's last reported position. Resplicing was possible, but the connection would remain exposed. German fire intensified as daylight waned, suggesting preparation for a final assault before nightfall. Under these conditions, Sokolov restored the line temporarily and tested the handset. After several attempts, a faint voice responded. The company commander reported severe losses and encroachment within adjacent rooms. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. He requested immediate mortar support and permission to withdraw to an interior wall closer to the battalion's center. The message, relayed back through the fragile line, enabled the battalion commander to authorize repositioning and direct available mortars. Within 20 minutes, indirect fire disrupted German consolidation efforts. Surviving riflemen from the right flank withdrew in small groups through pre-cleared passages. The line failed again shortly thereafter. By that point, the essential orders had passed. Sokolov returned to the basement command post after dark, assisted by stretcher-bearers who recovered Malinin. The corporal survived but would not return to duty. Such episodes accumulated over successive days. Each repair required exposure. Each exposure risked further reduction of already limited personnel. Battalion strength reports indicate that rifle companies originally numbering over 100 men were reduced to fewer than 40 effectives. Signal sections, though smaller, mirrored this attrition proportionally. Official communiques from higher command emphasized steadfast defense and the necessity of denying the enemy access to the river. Doctrine continued to assume reliable vertical communication between company, battalion, and regimental levels. In practice, Sokolov and his remaining men improvised horizontal links between neighboring strongpoints when formal channels failed. On 10th October, another concentrated assault targeted the Barrikady sector adjacent to Red October. Shock troops infiltrated through sewer lines and breached interior walls with explosives. Communications were disrupted not only by shell fire, but by physical occupation of cable routes. In some instances, German troops severed wires deliberately after locating them. Sokolov adapted by rerouting lines through upper floors. Despite the increased danger from snipers, he began marking critical junctions with small notches cut into door frames to facilitate rapid tracing under low light. The replacements under his supervision learned quickly, though fear was evident. One froze during an artillery barrage and required physical prompting to continue moving. By mid-October, temperatures dropped below freezing at night. Frost stiffened cable insulation, making it brittle. Improvised splices cracked when flexed. Radios suffered from battery drain accelerated by cold. Supply boats crossing the Volga faced intensified Luftwaffe attacks when weather cleared. Replacement wire arrived in shorter lengths, often salvaged from other sectors. The cumulative effect was fragmentation. Platoons occasionally operated for hours without contact, guided only by prearranged defensive sectors. When communication resumed, casualty figures often exceeded earlier estimates. Battalion staff recorded discrepancies between expected and actual manpower during roll calls conducted in basement corridors. Within this narrowing perimeter, Sokolov's duties extended beyond technical repair. He advised company commanders on establishing fallback communication nodes within stairwells less exposed to direct fire. Though not formally tasked with tactical planning, his familiarity with the physical network gave him influence over positioning decisions. The tension between official expectations and battlefield reality became more visible. Orders to hold specific grid references sometimes arrived after those coordinates had already changed hands multiple times. Maintaining a continuous front line was increasingly theoretical. Instead, defense relied on isolated pockets, capable of mutual support if communication allowed. On 14th October, German forces launched one of their largest assaults against the factory district, supported by heavy artillery and air bombardment. Entire sections of Red October were reduced further to rubble. During the opening barrage, 2 remaining primary lines from Sokolov's battalion headquarters were destroyed almost immediately. Inside the basement command post, dust filled the air. Lamps flickered as concussions shook the structure. The battalion commander requested immediate status reports from all companies, but none responded. Runners were deemed unlikely to survive the surface conditions. Sokolov assembled the 2 newest replacements and prepared to re-establish at least one circuit under what staff officers later described as near-continuous bombardment. The necessity was clear. Without situational awareness, coordinated defense would collapse into isolated resistance. As the men prepared to move out, the ground above continued to convulse under shell impact. The distance to the nearest forward strongpoint was no more than 100 meters, yet crossing it required navigating open spaces now devoid of cover. Each prior repair had narrowed the margin for error. The battalion's operational cohesion depended on wires that could be cut by a single fragment. The responsibility for restoring them fell to a shrinking group of men whose function had shifted from support to survival maintenance. The escalation was no longer episodic. It had become continuous. On 16 October 1942, following the major German assault 2 days earlier, the sector held by Sokolov's battalion was reduced to a cluster of interconnected cellars and shattered ground floors near the Volga embankment. The Red October factory complex, once a sprawling industrial site, had become an irregular grid of debris mounds and partial walls. Positions were defined less by map references than by surviving structural features: a stairwell, a furnace pit, a loading bay wall. The immediate operational priority was re-establishing command continuity after the bombardment of 14 October. For nearly 6 hours that day, battalion headquarters had received no reliable reports from 2 forward companies. Some resistance was audible, sporadic small arms fire and the detonation of grenades, but the overall disposition of forces remained uncertain. In the aftermath, Sokolov surveyed the remnants of the wire network. Of the 7 primary lines laid over the previous month, only fragments remained intact. Several cables had been buried beneath collapsed masonry. Others were missing entirely, likely severed and displaced during infantry advances. Radio communication offered only intermittent clarity. Batteries had dwindled to a small reserve, rationed for emergencies. Recognizing that re-establishing the previous network was impractical, Sokolov made a pragmatic adjustment. Rather than attempting to reconnect each forward platoon individually to battalion headquarters, he began consolidating communication nodes. Surviving company command posts were instructed, through messengers sent during a temporary lull, to shift closer to a central courtyard that still offered partial subterranean shelter. This reduced total cable length and limited exposure to open ground. The decision was not formally issued through written directive. It emerged from necessity and from Sokolov's assessment of what could realistically be maintained with 3 men and limited material. The battalion commander, informed of the proposal, gave tacit approval, provided that contact with regimental headquarters across the river remained uninterrupted. On 17 October, under reduced but persistent shell fire, Sokolov and 2 replacements laid a new primary trunk line through a narrow trench carved between collapsed walls. The trench had been dug earlier for infantry movement and offered marginal cover. Instead of routing cables along walls prone to collapse, he secured them to steel piping embedded within the rubble, reasoning that metal infrastructure was less likely to shift under concussive force. The work required repeated halts as German fire swept exposed intervals. During one such pause, a runner arrived with confirmation that the right flank company had been reduced to fewer than 20 effectives. The commander requested permission to integrate with an adjacent platoon to maintain a viable defensive front. Without functioning communication, such coordination would have been impossible. By nightfall, the consolidated network was operational. 3 forward positions, previously linked by separate lines, now fed into a single junction beneath a partially intact furnace hall. From there, a reinforced cable extended to the basement command post. The arrangement lacked redundancy but reduced overall vulnerability. This unofficial restructuring marked a turning point in Sokolov's approach. He ceased attempting to replicate pre-existing doctrinal layouts and instead focused on sustainability under siege conditions. His notebook entries shifted from formal call sign listings to rough diagrams of improvised routes and fallback junctions. The following days confirmed the value of the adjustment. German assault detachments continued probing attacks, but communication interruptions were shorter in duration. When one forward line was severed on 19 October, the junction allowed adjacent units to relay critical information laterally before it reached battalion headquarters. Artillery support, though limited, arrived with fewer delays. Risk, however, became more personal. On 20 October, during another attempt to reinforce a cable exposed by shifting debris, one of the new replacements, Private Yegorov, was killed by a sniper round while holding a spool. The loss reduced Sokolov's section to 2 men capable of field repair. The frequency of sorties did not diminish. By late October, Soviet High Command initiated preparations for a broader counteroffensive along the Don and Volga fronts. At the tactical level within the factory district, however, defensive pressure remained intense. German units sought incremental gains, often measured in rooms rather than streets. Sokolov's daily routine now included not only repair, but reconnaissance of potential alternate routes in anticipation of further collapses. He identified drainage channels and narrow service corridors that could conceal short stretches of cable. He instructed infantrymen assigned temporary support duty in basic splicing techniques to extend operational capacity. This diffusion of knowledge carried implicit risk. Signal procedures were not typically delegated to riflemen without training. Yet under existing conditions, rigid adherence to specialization was no longer practical. Battalion leadership did not formally endorse the measure, but neither did they countermand it. On 24 October, during a limited German penetration into a neighboring sector, communication between that unit and Sokolov's battalion was severed. For several hours, uncertainty spread regarding the extent of the breakthrough. Using the consolidated junction, Sokolov redirected one surviving line to establish temporary contact with the adjacent battalion's command post. The link was unstable, but sufficient to confirm that the breach had been contained locally. The adjustment prevented misallocation of reserves that might otherwise have been diverted from Sokolov's already strained perimeter. Though not recorded in official commendations, the effect was tangible within the immediate chain of command. As October drew to a close, the front line in the factory district stabilized into a pattern of close-quarter stalemate. Casualties remained heavy, but large-scale assaults diminished temporarily. The Volga continued to carry reinforcements at night, though ice began forming along its edges. Within the basement command post, the atmosphere shifted from acute crisis to sustained endurance. Maps were updated less frequently, as boundaries changed in increments too small for accurate cartography. Reports focused on ammunition levels, rations, and frostbite cases. Sokolov's network, though fragile, endured successive days without total collapse. It was not comprehensive, nor was it secure by peacetime standards. Yet it allowed battalion headquarters to maintain coordinated defense within a battlefield widely considered the most lethal of the Eastern Front. The cumulative strain was evident in the reduced size of his section and in the physical toll on remaining personnel. Nevertheless, the practical decision to consolidate and adapt communication routes had altered the battalion's immediate prospects. Survival no longer depended solely on holding individual positions, but on sustaining connection between them. In early November 1942, the tactical situation within the factory district remained largely static, yet the broader operational picture was shifting. Soviet forces north and south of Stalingrad were assembling reserves for a counteroffensive that would later be designated Operation Uranus. Within the narrow strip along the Volga, however, Immediate concerns were unchanged: ammunition, shelter, and communication. By 3rd November, temperatures had dropped consistently below freezing. Ice formed along the Volga's edge, complicating ferry crossings but also reducing the frequency of German air attacks against supply boats. Artillery exchanges continued daily, though the scale of German infantry assaults in the Red October sector decreased compared to mid-October. Sokolov's battalion occupied a compressed defensive arc no more than several hundred meters wide. The consolidated communication network established in late October remained in use, with minor adjustments as positions shifted by meters rather than blocks. The primary trunk line ran through the Furnace Hall Junction, reinforced with salvaged insulation and anchored to metal supports. 2 lateral connections linked adjacent strongpoints. A single line extended toward regimental headquarters near the riverbank. On the 5th November, a heavy artillery concentration struck the area surrounding the Furnace Hall. Concussive force collapsed part of the overhead structure, burying the junction beneath debris. The trunk line was severed in multiple places. Dust and smoke filled the corridor leading to the basement command post. For the first time since consolidation, all forward communications ceased simultaneously. The battalion commander faced an immediate operational dilemma. Without contact, artillery support could not be adjusted, and countermeasures against infiltration were limited. Intelligence suggested that German units were probing for weak points following bombardment. Sokolov assessed the damage and determined that clearing the original junction would require hours and tools not available under fire. Instead of attempting to restore the buried node, he proposed establishing a temporary bypass line directly from battalion headquarters to the most intact forward strongpoint on the left flank, then relaying messages laterally from there. The proposal departed further from established signal doctrine, which emphasized hierarchical routing. Direct bypass risked overloading a single position and complicating call sign procedures. Nevertheless, the battalion commander authorized the attempt. Accompanied by 1 remaining assistant, Sokolov moved through a narrow trench toward the left flank position. German mortar fire intermittently bracketed the area. Twice they were forced to halt as fragments struck nearby masonry. Upon reaching the strongpoint, a reinforced machine shop corner held by fewer than 30 riflemen, Sokolov established a direct line to battalion headquarters, using remaining cable reserves. Once contact was restored, the forward company commander relayed not only his own situation, but reports gathered from adjacent positions through shouted exchanges across walls and corridors. Though inefficient, this human relay compensated partially for the loss of formal lateral wiring. For several hours, this improvised configuration sustained coordination. Mortar fire was directed against suspected German assembly points. A small infiltration attempt on the right flank was identified through indirect reporting and repelled before consolidating. Later that evening, while reinforcing the bypass line with additional insulation against frost, Sokolov encountered resistance from a regimental signal officer who had crossed from the riverbank sector. The officer questioned the deviation from prescribed routing and expressed concern that bypassing standard nodes could create confusion in the event of further movement. The exchange remained controlled, but revealed tension between formal structure and field adaptation. Sokolov explained the physical impossibility of restoring the Furnace Hall Junction under current bombardment, and emphasized the necessity of maintaining any functional link. The regimental officer, after inspecting the collapsed site, refrained from issuing corrective orders but noted the deviation in his field report. Consequences of earlier adjustments became clearer in the following days. On 7 November, coinciding with Soviet commemorations of the October Revolution, German artillery renewed pressure across multiple sectors. The bypass configuration, though temporary in design, allowed the battalion to transmit status updates with minimal delay. Adjacent units, informed through lateral voice relay, coordinated defensive fire more effectively than during prior communication collapses. However, reliance on a single strongpoint as relay hub increased its exposure. German reconnaissance appeared to identify increased activity in that sector. On 9 November, concentrated small arms and mortar fire targeted the machine shop corner. Casualties mounted among the relay position's riflemen. The risk inherent in centralizing communication became evident. Faced with mounting losses at the relay hub, Sokolov began preparing an alternate fallback route during nighttime hours. Using a partially intact drainage channel running beneath a collapsed wall, he laid a concealed secondary line toward another forward cellar less visible from German observation points. The work was conducted incrementally, in short segments, to avoid detection. On 12 November, German forces attempted another localized penetration near the original furnace hall site. Though the junction remained buried, the bypass and secondary line enabled rapid warning. Reserves were repositioned within minutes rather than hours. The attack was contained within a limited radius. The regimental signal officer returned briefly to review the revised network. While formal commendation was not issued, he acknowledged in conversation with the battalion commander that rigid adherence to prior layouts would likely have resulted in prolonged isolation during the early November bombardment. By mid-November, preparations for the Soviet counteroffensive intensified beyond the factory district. Artillery units across the Volga increased calibration fire. Within Sokolov's immediate sector, defensive posture remained unchanged. The battalion was ordered to maintain pressure and deny further German consolidation. The physical toll on Sokolov was evident. His uniform was worn thin at elbows and knees from repeated crawling. Frostbite threatened fingers exposed during wire splicing. Sleep occurred in brief intervals between repair sorties. Yet the network, though simplified and repeatedly damaged, continued functioning in some capacity. On 19 November 1942, Soviet forces north and south of Stalingrad launched Operation Uranus, targeting Romanian units guarding the flanks of the German Sixth Army. Within the factory district, initial signs of the larger maneuver were indirect. An increase in distant artillery rumble and altered German fire patterns. Immediate conditions for Sokolov's battalion remained defensive, but the strategic balance was beginning to shift. The consequences of prior improvisations were not dramatic in isolation. They did not produce decisive breakthroughs or public recognition. They ensured instead that during critical hours of bombardment and infiltration, battalion command retained awareness of its shrinking perimeter. As reports filtered in that Soviet armored formations had achieved breakthroughs on the Don front, morale within the factory sector lifted cautiously. Yet until German pressure eased locally, survival remained dependent on fragile lines stretched through frozen rubble. By late November 1942, confirmation reached the factory district that Soviet forces advancing from the north and south had encircled the German Sixth Army. The encirclement did not immediately reduce pressure within the Red October sector. German units, now aware of their isolation, intensified efforts to secure defensible ground along the Volga in anticipation of relief operations. Local engagements continued with undiminished severity. Within Sokolov's battalion, communication lines remained essential as defensive tasks shifted subtly from static resistance to preparation for coordinated counterpressure. Artillery allocations were recalculated. Ammunition was redistributed based on revised frontage assessments. Each adjustment required reliable transmission of orders across terrain, still under direct observation. On 23 November, German forces conducted a concentrated attempt to reclaim ground near the buried Furnace Hall Junction. Though the broader encirclement had begun, tactical objectives within the city persisted. Heavy mortar fire preceded infantry movement through shattered assembly rooms. The relay strongpoint established earlier in the month absorbed significant impact. The primary bypass line was severed during the opening barrage. The concealed drainage channel cable remained intact, but had not yet been integrated fully into daily operations. For several critical minutes, battalion headquarters received no forward reports. Sokolov, aware of the secondary line's incomplete integration, moved to activate it despite ongoing fire. The drainage channel was narrow, partially flooded, and obstructed by ice. Progress required crawling through water, mixed with debris. Twice he paused as explosions above dislodged fragments into the channel. Reaching the alternate cellar strongpoint, he established contact using the concealed cable. The forward position reported German infantry advancing cautiously, but encountering stiff resistance from remaining machine gun crews at the relay hub. Though the original bypass was down, the new route restored situational awareness. The battalion commander redirected reserves along interior passages identified in prior reconnaissance. Because communication resumed quickly, repositioning occurred before German forces could consolidate captured rooms. The attack stalled within hours, leaving the front line altered by only a few meters. Consequences of earlier decentralization became evident during post-action review. While the relay strongpoint had suffered casualties due to its elevated profile, the existence of the secondary concealed line prevented a complete operational blackout. Regimental staff, informed of the engagement's details, noted the effectiveness of redundant routing adapted to urban conditions. Pushback from higher authority was limited but present. A written inquiry requested clarification on deviations from standard signal diagrams filed earlier in the campaign. The battalion commander responded by citing material shortages and structural collapse as justification. Sokolov's name appeared in annex documentation describing field modifications. No formal reprimand followed, though neither did commendation. As November ended, German air resupply efforts intensified overhead. Aircraft dropped containers into encircled positions, some landing within Soviet-held sectors. Sporadic fighting erupted around contested supply bundles. Communication lines, often running near open courtyards, were again at risk from incidental impact. On 2nd December, one such container struck near the secondary drainage channel entrance, collapsing part of the passage. The concealed cable was severed and partially buried. Repair required excavation under intermittent small arms fire from German positions attempting retrieval of the dropped supplies. Sokolov and two temporarily assigned riflemen undertook the repair at dusk. Working by limited lantern light, shielded by debris, they cleared ice and fragments until the cable was exposed. The splice was completed with remaining insulated tape, salvaged from abandoned equipment. Cold had stiffened their hands to the point that fine manipulation was difficult. During this period, reports from beyond the city indicated that German relief attempts under Operation Winter Storm were advancing from the south, but had not yet reached the encircled Sixth Army. Within the factory district, anticipation of potential renewed assault increased vigilance. Ammunition was conserved. Patrols were minimized to essential reconnaissance. The stakes within Sokolov's immediate sphere were no longer confined to holding a shrinking perimeter. The survival of the battalion depended on enduring until the encirclement tightened irreversibly. Any prolonged communication failure risked localized collapse that German forces could exploit to re-establish a corridor to the river. On 12th of December, German forces initiated renewed localized attacks, coinciding with relief operations outside the city. Artillery struck repeatedly at known command post locations. The basement housing battalion headquarters sustained structural cracks but remained intact. During the barrage, the primary trunk line failed once more. This time, however, the secondary route remained functional. Forward companies reported German infiltration attempts using smoke cover. Mortar adjustments were transmitted without significant delay. Reserve platoons were shifted preemptively to reinforce vulnerable sectors. In the days that followed, relief forces advancing from the south were halted short of Stalingrad. Within the encircled city, German units began exhibiting signs of logistical strain. Assault intensity in the factory district diminished gradually, though sporadic engagements continued. The cumulative effect of sustained adaptation became apparent. While losses within the battalion were heavy and positions remained precarious, the communication network, though repeatedly damaged and simplified, had not collapsed entirely during peak stress periods. The earlier decision to abandon rigid structure in favor of flexible routing reduced isolation during critical engagements. By late December 1942, temperatures plunged further. Frost thickened along exposed cables. Movement slowed across icy rubble. Yet German offensive capability within the sector waned noticeably. Within the basement command post, maps showed marginal advances rather than retreats. Reports from regimental headquarters indicated tightening encirclement conditions for the 6th Army. The battalion's task shifted subtly from desperate defense to sustained containment. For Sokolov, the work remained unchanged in routine, but altered in context. Repair and maintenance continued daily. The difference lay in the diminishing frequency of large-scale assaults. Survival, once measured hour by hour under immediate threat of overrun, now extended into weeks of endurance.